I think our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. You know? And I think that's what I sussed when I was 16 and 12, way down the line. But I expressed it differently all through my life. It's the same thing I'm expressing all the time, but now I can put it into that sentence that I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends, you know. If anybody can put on paper what our government and the American government, etc., and the Russian, Chinese, what they are actually trying to do, you know, and what they think they're doing, I'd be very pleased to know what they think they're doing. I think they're all insane, you know, but I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that. You know, that's what's insane about it.
There's a thought crime running through my head. Can't take these rules, and people are fools who believe what they read and believe what they see, believe what they see on the TV. Opinions are like iPhones. Everybody's got one.
Hello, welcome to Glass Onion on John Lennon. This is episode 8 called John Lennon, Gimme Some Truth. So I hope you had a pleasant week last week. As I predicted, Brexit didn't get resolved. I did watch some of the coverage last Friday afternoon, and it's a strange juxtaposition of something that's incredibly important but at the same time difficult to take seriously as well. I haven't checked the news today, but who knows what's going to happen with this. I mean, it could drag on for a long time. And of course, for those who don't want to leave the EU, that could be considered a good thing, that the political process is so slow and laborious. It's actually a very interesting look at human nature and the tribal nature of it. I was told a long time ago the best key to human nature is to read up on how tribes worked in the past. We really haven't moved on too much from that. I will talk about human nature a little bit later as well. So this episode really, this is a solo episode. It's just an opportunity for me to riff on the idea of truth, you know, dun. What is truth? This is not going to be a philosophical talk necessarily. I've just got a few references that I'd like to make. And I will have a look at the John Lennon song, Gimme Some Truth, later on. Let's set the scene first. So I'm here in Madrid, Spain. It's early afternoon, nice and sunny, and nice chance to get away from the grind of work. I've got a bit of free time, unmolested, to record this. So I thought I'd start actually with a few quotes about truth. I have found these through internet pages. I do know that some of them have been in circulation for a long time, so I know that some of them are genuine. There's one that I don't think is genuine, but I'll get to that. So first of all, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. And that's Mark Twain. Can't possibly talk about quotes about anything without including Mark Twain. And Oscar Wilde. The truth is rarely pure and never simple. Is a reference to the expression, the pure and simple truth. So he's really saying that the truth is rather ugly, which again, I'll get to that later. Truth is a beautiful and terrible thing and should therefore be treated with great caution. And this is from none other than J.K. Rowling, with the voice of Dumbledore in the Harry Potter books. Now, I've only ever read one Harry Potter book, and I've never seen any of the films, but that sounds like quite a dark quote, and I know they did get a bit more adult, not pornographic adult, but for adults. So I imagine that's one of the later books, but maybe someone could tell me that. The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. Great quote. From the 12 Steps to Happiness book. Self-help book, I imagine. In a time of deceit, telling the truth can be a revolutionary act. That's George Orwell. The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it. Which is another one I like. Flannery O'Connor, who's an American novelist. I know from my own journey of trying to find my own truth and investigating my flaws and trying to find some meaning to my life that the truth can be very uncomfortable and difficult to stomach. Art is the lie that enables us to realize the truth. That's from a young man from Malaga called Pablo Picasso, who was a gifted artist, something of a madman as well, from all accounts. So he's saying that art is a lie. So perhaps he's saying that by being an artist and being creative, you discover the lie which is your own life perhaps, or certain things you believe about yourself and your own life that enables you to realise the truth. I've always sort of drawn to quotes that have irony attached to them, because I think the older I get, the more I realise how crazily ironic life is. Life is a tragicomedy. That's what I've decided. Of all the genres available, if I was going to make a movie about life, that was the one I'd choose. Rather than love or money or fame, give me truth. And that's Henry David Thoreau from a book called Walden, which, coincidentally enough, I was looking at these quotes this morning. 2 weeks ago I was recommended the book Walden, which is also known, I think, as Life in the Woods, and it came out in the 1850s. And it's all about the simple life and living in nature, that kind of thing. Living off the grid, as the popular modern saying would have it. So yeah, a good one for John Lennon, really. I'm sure. Love, he says, rather than love or money or fame, give me truth. Now, presumably love maybe perhaps meant in the terms of adoration, from fans, or just telling you you're wonderful all the time. I'm sure John Lennon got pretty sick of that quickly. And the money and the fame. When he met Yoko Ono, he said to his best friend Pete Shotton, I'll go and live in a tent. I don't give a toss about my money, or give up this house and go and live in a tent with her if I have to. And then obviously Give Me Truth is related to the title of this podcast and the song which we're going to be looking at later on. Now, interestingly, there's another quote from a young man called John Lennon. I believe in everything until it's disproved, so I believe in fairies, the myths, dragons. It all exists, even if it's in your mind. Who's to say that dreams and nightmares aren't as real as the here and now? Now, there are a lot of quotes attributed to John Lennon on the internet with nice photos and pictures of him. I've listened to most of his interviews that are available, and I've listened to some of them on multiple occasions. And I don't remember him ever saying that. If he did, I'm happy to be corrected. But it does sound like something he might have said. It all exists, even if it's in your mind. Who's to say that dreams and nightmares aren't as real in the here and now? Beatles fans may know the book The Day John Met Paul, which was written by Jim O'Donnell, and it's a reconstruction, if you like, of the famous day, 6th of July 1957, which I talked about with Rod Davis a few episodes ago. And it takes you through that July day in the 50s in Liverpool and also around the world. And it paints a very interesting portrait of the teenage John Lennon. Now, Jim O'Donnell, by his own admission, was just inventing a bit of dialogue, and he was making his own observations. One quote I do remember distinctly from reading that book, which again I read quite a few times, is that he said John Lennon's deepest sense of reality comes from his dreams. And we know there's a famous quote from George Martin about John Lennon sort of finding normal life a bit too boring, which I've probably found myself when I was younger. And now I've realised it's kind of my responsibility to fill my time productively and with things that interest me, and that it is somewhat in my control. But, John Lennon went through a very, very long period of, drug addiction, drug abuse. I would just say drug use. I don't know at what point use becomes abuse. Clearly he was addicted to heroin, but I think through his life he had an already expansive mind, which became an expanded mind by things he took, but also things he read and people he associated with. It's all kinds of things. I think dreams are very important, and although dream analysis would be considered, a pseudoscience by some, and that, there are rough associations that can be made, there's symbols that occur in dreams, and I don't think, that's a foolproof way of analysing dreams. But dreams, of course, are your unconscious, some people would say, sifting through your day. But it's not just the events of your day, that have happened with your conscious mind. It's all kinds of things. It's your history. It could even be your future. Who knows what pointers dreams could give to somebody's future. I have a pretty active dream world, so to speak. And I mean the dream world I have when I'm asleep rather than the one I have when I'm awake. That's another story. And I wrote up, I've always made a note of my dreams, or the more interesting ones. And last year I took a few hours and wrote up every single one I could remember and all the ones I had notes from, and I looked for a bit of analysis. And it's very interesting that some of the things you dream about are important things in your life and are worth investigating, particularly if they reoccur, the old recurring dreams. And, I've also had in the past hypnotherapy, which is very interesting because it's going through the conscious mind, in that case into the subconscious mind, because you're still aware of where you are, but you're in a more suggestive state, and certain ideas can be suggested to you to improve your life that you'd be more receptive to without the filter of the conscious mind. You know, I mean, I could go on a very long tangent about how we filter information and how we basically block a lot of the truth or certain truths, often without realizing it. You know, that's an unconscious thing as well. We have defenses. We all have that, and our defense mechanisms are very adept at quickly filtering or stifling anything that our delicate egos don't want to hear, basically. That might be worth thinking about, you know, in your daily life. How much of the truth are you filtering without realizing it? You know, and now as life gets busier and busier, if people don't have so much free time, you know, if you've got kids, you need 2 incomes. And, who's going to spend their precious time reflecting on the darker recesses of their nature? Well, a few people might do that, and I applaud them for that. But, just think about certain things. I mean, just one thing, for example, is marriage. I mean, I'm not married, and I've never been married. But we all know that in the past, a lot of marriages were arranged. And, of course, that still goes on now in countries like India. We know that arranged marriages still exist. But, of course, in the West, we think, well, we'd never submit to an arranged marriage. And we probably wouldn't in the literal sense. But then, if you take that forward, my grandparents met in, I'm going to say the 1930s, somewhere around then, pre-war. And by all accounts, they had a limited number of dates before they got engaged and then got married and had a child. And the criteria in those days, in middle-class society, criteria is that the man was respectable, presented himself well, was well-dressed, had a good job, and was decent level of intelligence, I guess, and education. And, I don't want to get too personal, but my grandparents spent over 60 years together and spent most of that time arguing because they were very incompatible. So that's something that goes against kind of marriages based on limited criteria, let's say. But, I remember reading a few years ago when I was studying, we're talking about marriage, and they were saying that even modern marriage is, to some extent, an economic agreement. There is an agreement to do with marriage, and of course, having a license, it's a licensed union. The comedian Doug Stanhope famously said, why do I need to inform the government that I'm in love? Why do I have to be officially in love? And, it's considered very cynical to question, true love and things. But The Road Less Travelled by M. Scott Peck, which is a very good book, I recommend that. He talks about love, and his view of love is that perhaps, particularly when we first meet someone, when we talk about falling in love, we're really talking about falling in lust. And that physical lust and drives are actually what is superseding this feeling of love that you find in poems and Hollywood films and the like. And I'm not totally cynical about that. I'm all for questioning things, and I think there's too many things. In my long journey of about 10 years of trying to unlearn things I was taught, I've had to really confront some things that I was brought up to believe, and finding that there are flaws in them, and there are holes in them. All I'm really doing here, this is a podcast about John Lennon, but I have appeared on other podcasts related to alternative media and conspiracies and the truth movement, which I'm going to talk about later as well. I'm deferring a lot of things to later, but they're all in my notes, so we're going to get there, don't worry. Worth a thought, these kind of things. And John Lennon, in the Gimme Some Truth film, which was about the making of Imagine, John Lennon talks about his relationship with Yoko Ono, and he's very truthful. He says, I want to possess her, I don't want to believe that I want to possess her, but I do, that's quite a bold statement. When I did my talk with Dave Thurmeyer, which was the previous 2 episodes of this podcast, we talked about whether, as a famous person, bearing your soul to the public is a courageous act or a self-indulgent, egotistical act, or a little bit of both. And during that talk also I talked a lot about Marlon Brando, and I made quite a lot of comparisons, so I'm just going to mention Marlon again. When I was 14 in the late 80s, I came across on TV an interview that Marlon Brando did with Connie Chung, and 1989 it was, in fact. And, I was at a pretty young age, and I knew a little bit about Marlon Brando. I knew Godfather, and I probably knew Streetcar. And Marlon Brando at that point was in his mid-60s and was quite a formidable figure, quite a scary figure, in fact. That interview is also free to view on YouTube. That's worth a look. Just put Marlon Brando, Connie Chung, 1989. But he said some things that I've never forgotten. You know, when you absorb things as a kid or as a young person, they do tend to bite deeper, or they go deeper into your consciousness. It's probably one of the reasons that he's continued to be a fascinating figure for me. Anyway, the two things that I remember him saying that he said to Connie Chung said, do you realise, people think you're the best actor in the world? And Connie Chung would have known, of course, that Marlon Brando had displayed open contempt for acting and said it was a childish way to spend your time, or something like that, he said. Anyway, he said to her, everyone in this life is an actor. And he said, we're always acting. And he said, he gave the example of a friend of yours, if it's a female, she may have bought a dress, or a male friend who's got a new shirt and says, hey, what do you think of my shirt? And you know that if you told them the truth, in this case, let's say that you think it's a really ugly dress or a horrible shirt, don't like the colour, you're not going to say that. Now, that is, of course, an example of a white lie, which in many ways is considered a positive thing, because you're trying not to hurt their feelings. But really, that's just one example. We're all acting. I mean, if you're going imagine you're walking down the street one morning and you're in a bit of a pensive mood or slightly annoyed about something, and you might be mulling it over in your mind with a sort of serious look on your face, and then you suddenly meet someone in the street. Now, the majority of people will immediately switch into social mode. Hi, how you doing? Yeah, nice to see you. And this sort of script will come out almost that I really do feel like we're reading the life script, the script from how to be a successful person in society, how to be respectable. So, that's worth thinking about. The other thing he said to her, she was saying, oh, I read this about you, or I heard this about you. And he said to her very, very clearly, and his eyes were burning into the camera, he said, you shouldn't ever believe what you read, and you shouldn't ever believe what you hear. And I paid a little bit of tribute to that with my song, The Fool's Guide, which is the one you hear at the beginning of this podcast. Very interesting. And, of course, I think the distinction needs to be made. When he's saying that, he's not saying that everything you read and hear is rubbish, is untrue, is bullshit. What he's saying is don't believe everything. He's not saying don't disbelieve everything. He's saying, consider things a bit more. Don't just swallow what you're given just because the person on TV looks, very respectable. I remember when they were honouring Walter Cronkite, who's a famous American broadcaster. Hillary Clinton, God bless her, was there, and she said, we always knew it was the truth when we heard it from Walter Cronkite, which of course is laughable because he wasn't coming up with the news, he was just delivering it. But she actually inadvertently made a very profound point, which is that you get the right guy with an authoritative voice and you're going to believe everything he tells you on the evening news, particularly if you come home tired from work and, you're too tired to consider your darker nature, as I said earlier. But anyway, so yeah, very interesting stuff. In fact, to back up Marlon's second point there, I flat shared with a guy in London. I had a number of flat shares, and I had one in West London. And I was in my early to mid-20s, I think. And this guy was a little bit older. He was about 30 or 31, something like that. And he was a guy who was into sort of deep state, which is sort of the government behind the government, if you know what I mean, the invisible government, false flag terrorism, conspiracies, that kind of thing. And I was, I kind of pride myself on being open-minded, and I was always fairly open to those kind of things. But I didn't know much about it. And he told me that a few years ago he got a job in a newspaper office as basically a tea boy. He had no aspirations to be a journalist. He just wanted to know what it was like there. And he said, I used to poke about looking for things, and used to talk to the journalists, and they'd go for drinks after work, and the journalists would open up a bit and tell them how it worked. And he just said exactly the same thing as Marlon Brando. He said, don't believe anything you read. It's all manufactured. Again, it's organised. That's what I'd call it, rather than just... Newspapers don't just sit there just constantly making up stories. They embellish. There's also sin by omission, of course, which is not telling you things that you should be told or burying them in. I've done a couple of podcasts, and I wrote a very long blog post about the BBC comedy Yes Minister and spin-off Yes Prime Minister. And really, it's all there. I mean, if you've never seen those programs, just go and watch them. And as you're watching, use a bit of analysis and think about what you're being told here. And it's all there. It tells you exactly how the media works and how the world works, essentially, within the context of British politics. But I'm pretty sure it's not that different. But I know it's not that different in other countries. It's just degrees of the same thing, really. As I said, I did get involved in the sort of truth movement, which I'm going to talk about later, to do with conspiracies. But I'd caution, as well as cautioning against believing everything you read, I'd caution against going the other way, and David Icke, who actually take a lot more seriously than a lot of people do in England. I've got a lot out of a lot of the talks he's done. He had a book recently that's, I don't know if it's the title or the subtitle is, It's All Bollocks, all of it. And that is what I'd guard against, because then you're almost doing exactly the same thing, but in reverse. You're just believing what the alternative tells you, or you're taking the news and just believing the opposite. So I think a bit of nuance is very important. Yeah, it's interesting to see that in mainstream life, mainstream TV, which I don't really watch any of anymore. I mean, I live in Spain and I've watched a bit of Spanish TV just purely for language, help learn the language, but I've never really got into that. It's interesting that on mainstream TV, every now and again, someone will say something that's, I find, a little bit more truthful than the usual view of the world that's presented, which is very, very sanitized. And of course, Louis C.K., who I know has been disgraced, but I don't believe that when someone's disgraced, that automatically discredits everything they've done before. I don't believe that. He had an appearance on the Conan show in America, and I'll put a link to this as well. And I'm paraphrasing what he said, but he was talking about texting, and he was saying that in order to avoid any moments of sadness, nowadays, as soon as any of us feel sad, we start texting people. And we're willing to risk our lives. We'll be driving in a car and feeling sad, and we'll start texting people, because then we'll get that lovely dopamine rush of people replying. And anyone listening to this who doesn't think they're guilty of that, take a long look at yourself and tell me you've never done that in your life. I don't believe I'm enslaved to it, Notice that I don't believe I'm enslaved to it. But I think it's healthy to call yourself out about things sometimes. And Louis C.K. on this TV appearance talked about, he said, there's an emptiness in all of us, and Conan immediately, I think, nodded his head and agreed. And that's actually a very profound statement, because the level in mainstream media of truth is very, very limited. And, again, if you don't think that you're influenced by media and things around you, again, I would challenge you on that. This is apparently the cynical age, none of us believes what we think. But, the way that Brexit, for example, has been manipulated into these camps, again, which is tribal, as I was saying earlier. But when the vote came in 2016, the next day on social media, there were all kinds of people I would consider quite educated and open-minded just immediately screaming, "Oh, you racists!" This 52% of racists who voted to leave the EU. And these kind of, you could call them memes, I suppose, nowadays, but really they're just sort of stereotypes. They're easy labels. We're all a bit guilty of that, and we have to be really cautious when we're being given information to really question it and not just pay lip service to questioning things, but actually do it. Around the 2010s, I was working with activists, not for money, but working with activist groups, including 9/11 Truth. And rather than sort of have placards and protest and things like that, and I think there is definitely a place for street protests and public protests, but we decided that much better would be to invite people to watch documentaries. So we'd organise documentary screenings. Another thing we did is that we got ourselves a corner on the main street in Oxford Street, Regent Street, one of those, and we basically had a sign saying, "We have important questions for you. Please see us," or something like that. Or if you'd like to answer, and we would tell people straight that we're going to ask them some questions. And I think some of that ended up on YouTube. I don't know if it's there anymore. But we really got a good idea of what the average, middle class or working class, doesn't really matter. We would ask some questions like, who is Noam Chomsky? Tell me who he is. And I think we kind of did it almost as a sort of survey. And I think out of 50 people we asked, I think 5 people had heard of Noam Chomsky. And even if you're someone who doesn't agree with him, I mean, he is an important person in terms of critique of American foreign policy and other things and the way the world works. You know, the truth or conspiracy people don't like him because he doesn't say anything about JFK, 9/11 and the idea that they may not have been what we were told they were. So he's alienated those camps, and he's sort of in the middle, really. He's a sort of alternative mainstream, or mainstream alternative. He's somewhere in the middle of those camps, so maybe he's alienated both camps, but I still like him. So I'd recommend, Manufacturing Consent is a book and a film. I think the book kind of keeps making the same point over and over, so I'd probably recommend the film, documentary. That'll be free to view, I'm sure. Or anything by Chomsky, really. Another one with media is Orwell Rolls in His Grave. That's another good documentary. Again, on the subject of truth, the books of Robert Greene. His latest one is called The Laws of Human Nature, and I absorbed that one. They're all tomes, basically, all of his books. His most famous one's probably The 48 Laws of Power, which was the first one he published. It became a bestseller, must be about 20 years ago now. But The Laws of Human Nature is a great book, and it's really a devastating look at people and what we're really like and what we want to believe that we're like. And somewhere in that book and on other books that I've read, there's a sort of list that's fairly universally accepted by researchers and psychology professionals about what people want to believe about themselves. And there's this kind of a list, and among them there's people want to believe that they're virtuous and good. And again, I think in daily life people generally do try to do good. But there's a dark side of human nature that I think you may never encounter for your whole life. I mean, there's a school of thought that says that none of us know our true personality. None of us can really know our true personality until we're, just to give an example, faced down by a lion in the jungle, which is almost certainly never going to happen to the majority of us. But something like that where, or perhaps, we were on the Titanic and we're in the middle of the Atlantic at 2 o'clock in the morning in the dark with 1,500 other people thrashing around, screaming in absolutely freezing water. Do you know how you'd react in that way? Would you be honourable? Would you try and, if you're in the Twin Towers on September 11th, would you be saving other people? Would you be running for your life? And among the other things in Robert Greene's book is that people want to believe that they're independent thinkers. And, I could talk all day about how media and propaganda is based on psychology. It's based on knowing people better than they know themselves, which would come through psychological research. So if you take that as read, that people think they're independent thinkers, then really the media can't lose, because no one wants to say, oh, I've been duped. I might be stupid. I might have been stupid in that situation because I was told something and I believed it and it turned out to be false. Do I want to admit that? Maybe not. So really on this section talking about truth as an entity and truth in everyday life and mainstream life, we're all subject as well to the sort of propaganda of association. So, as I said, the Remainers in the Brexit camp have been given this association of their opponents as racist and narrow-minded and bigoted. But think about it, here's an association that's an interesting one. Alcohol. What do we do when we celebrate? We break out the bubbly, get the champagne going when we've got a job or, we've won the lottery or whatever, or won some money or whatever it is. We drink champagne or beer or whatever. And what do we do when we've had some bad news? When our spouse has left us, when we've lost our job, we drown our sorrows. So think about that for a second. The alcohol industry is doing well out of this. So the alcohol industry basically wins any time that life goes up and down for people. Popcorn and cinema, there's another one. I used to go to the cinema a lot. I haven't been for years, actually, but in my teens and my 20s, I used to go at least once a week. And I would never dream of watching a film without a big load of popcorn, sugary or salty popcorn, for me to munch. And I generally munched it by the time the adverts were over. It was never quite an association between popcorn and the actual film I was watching. It was popcorn and being in the cinema. So I hope I'm giving you a few things to think about there. Now, on this subject of truth, I did want to just mention that there is a thing called the truth movement. Now, it's also known, and I think a better name is the alternative media. And it's essentially giving you an alternative look at news events. Now, this alternative look, I don't mean in the comedic sense. This is actually deadly serious. But I absorb a lot of news through podcasts. I do browse mainstream news. I look at a few news sources. I look at the bare facts and then try and analyze it myself. But podcasts are a wonderful thing. They're free. If you want to become a patron of a podcast, you can go to Patreon, not this podcast, I'm talking about other ones, patreon.com, and you can give donations. But essentially, podcasts are there for free, and there's an incredible amount out there. I mean, this podcast's about more or less everything you could ever dream of. And they're on iTunes, it's where I get mine from. Obviously, I put my own podcast on SoundCloud at the moment. But the alternative media is not an official organisation, but around the sort of early 2000s, around 9/11, there started to be, with the internet, possibilities for getting alternative media out there, alternative viewpoints, and actually having a proper platform. Because if you ever look on, I said on mainstream TV, if you ever get like someone who doesn't believe in the official myth, the official story of 9/11, they will invariably be marginalised. They'll be given probably 2 minutes. They'll be shouted over. Well, if you're on Fox News, they'll be very, very overtly sort of shouted down. On the BBC, maybe if you look at the guy who was the ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, look at any clips from last year about him talking about the Skripal affair, or really anything to do with Syria and Russia. They'd use all these subtle tactics like saying, oh, your opinion, that seems to coincide with a Russian opinion. There's subtle ways of marginalising people. Anyway, podcast gives me and other people a chance to basically say things without filters now. There is advertising attached to podcasts, and obviously if you do decide to go down that route, then you may or may not be compromised in terms of your content. But, 9/11 was one of the catalysing events, and I'm not going to go through all the evidence now, but I will just give you one thing to think about. I mean, everyone remembers where they were on this day. That's not a cliche, I think. Everyone does. I mean, I'd just come back from backpacking around the world, and I was staying at my sister Helen's house, and there was her and my niece, who was maybe 3 years old at that time, and my little nephew, who I think was just 1 year old, and we were watching this unfolding. And I do remember at that time I felt like the world was going through a period of craziness already. I remember when we first switched on the TV and the first plane had already hit, I remember looking at it and not being entirely surprised, but then, seeing the second plane live on TV and then seeing this sort of rolling news coverage. And you'll notice if you remember, a lot of people saying, oh, it's like a movie. They were comparing it to like Independence Day or something like that. And on the news, they kept showing the footage of the towers falling, after they fell after an hour or so. I think even less than an hour in the case of the South Tower. And sort of rolling news had these towers coming down every 5 seconds. I didn't really think much of it at the time. And I was young. I probably got caught up in the sort of movie aspect of it, the excitement of this big event. Because, again, let's be honest, there's horror attached to 9/11, and nobody wants to see people losing their lives in such a horrific way. But, TV is entertainment. It's selling you something that's worth watching, and that's not cynical. Well, it is cynical, but I'm saying it's not deliberately cynical. Just do some study of media. Nowadays you don't have to take a course at university or college. It's all out there. All the information is out there. And anyway, really, I think the first sort of stirrings in the mainstream that anything might have been wrong with 9/11 and the official narrative might have had some holes in it was probably Michael Moore's film Fahrenheit 9/11, which came out in 2004. So it's a good 3 years, and I don't think, honestly, there were too many people questioning it directly after the event. But very interestingly, if you go to YouTube again, I know that mentioning the word Alex Jones is rather like David Icke. It's going to immediately alienate a certain number of people. But Alex Jones in 2001 was a slightly different animal to the one he's become now. You can listen to, I think, most of his broadcasts from 9/11 as it was happening. And also Bill Cooper, who wrote a famous book called Behold a Pale Horse. He died in dubious circumstances. Have a look at that, William Cooper. And he also did predict to some extent 9/11. There's a broadcast from, I think, May of that year, 2001, where he's saying there's going to be a major terrorist attack and it's going to be blamed on Osama bin Laden.
Let me tell you something. If he's an enemy of Israel and the Mossad can't find him, then this thing is the biggest joke that you ever heard of in your life. And I'm telling you, be prepared for a major attack. But it won't be Osama bin Laden. It will be those behind the New World Order who once again want to take the guns and the freedom away from the American people because we're the only ones left in the world who can oppose the destruction of freedom in the world and then the implementation of a one-world totalitarian socialist government, and that is the goal. And whatever is going to happen that they're going to blame on Osama bin Laden, don't you even believe it. Another social illusion, social engineering project to change the minds and the attitudes and the beliefs of the people of the world, and especially the United States, to bring about one world socialist totalitarian government. I wonder what Osama bin Laden's targets are supposed to be. And if they don't, if this doesn't materialize in the next 2 or 3 weeks, it will eventually materialize because they haven't succeeded in getting the guns out of the hands of the American people, nor have they succeeded in taking our freedoms away.
His broadcast from 9/11 is also available, and whether or not you believe it, what's interesting about it is that they are talking about controlled demolition on the day. They're not doing it, 5 years after the fact. I mean, 9/11 Truth in England, which was spearheaded to some extent by Ian Crane and David Shayler, I think it peaked around 2007, which is when I became aware of all this kind of information. But people were questioning it on the day, and one of the reasons they were suspicious was because of the Oklahoma City bombing, which again, a good documentary called A Noble Lie about that. And they were claiming that that's what had happened in Oklahoma, which had been 6 years before 9/11. But anyway, just to say that there were people questioning things on the day, which means that they weren't just piggybacking on Michael Moore or whatever. And in fact, the things that William Cooper and Alex Jones were mentioning on the day were nothing to do with things that Michael Moore talked about. So that's that one. And then, of course, in London, we had our own 9/11, which is now known as 7/7, which is where bombs went off on tube trains and a bus in Tavistock Square. Now, again, there are a number of researchers which would be dismissed as conspiracy theories by a lot of people, but Tom Secker, who I've had some email contact with in the past, he did a film called 7/7 Seeds of Deconstruction, which is well worth watching, again, free to view. He followed it up, actually, with one called 7/7 Crime and Prejudice, which is to do with a thing called predictive programming, which is where you put something in a fictional TV show that then happens later, and it supposedly primes the public to accept it. So he's a credible researcher, and there are a number of other ones. And podcasts and independent radio shows, they give you a chance to talk for, as I'm doing now, but I'm only talking for about an hour probably here, but, there are 4 or 5 hour podcasts. There's a great one called Those Conspiracy Guys, which is actually made by a bunch of Irish comedians. They also look at things in great depth, and they go on for hours. Only maniacs like me that listen to something of that length, 5-6 hours or whatever it is. If anyone is interested in sort of maybe nuancing their view a little bit and questioning things, just 3 podcasts I'd throw out there. Joe Rogan Experience. Joe Rogan is a mainstream figure in America, and he's quite non-committal on things like 9/11, but he has very interesting guests, and they riff for a long time on all kinds of things. The Mind Renewed, which yours truly has appeared on a few times, that's run by Julian Charles. TheMindRenewed.com is a website where you can find the podcast, and on iTunes as well. And the other one is Tangentially Speaking, which is Chris Ryan, who originally wrote the book Sex at Dawn, which became a big seller. And if you spend time with these people, I mean, I said Joe Rogan, I'd probably focus more on his guests, although he's pretty good on things like diet and you're just going to get a more alternative view, and you spend a bit of time with these people and you download their podcasts and subscribe to them and you're listening to them regularly. It does alter your view. If you don't want your view altered, then of course that's fair enough. It's up to you. But, if you listen to a few of these podcasts, and then you'll see recommended podcasts that are linked to those, and it's a big chain, and it could potentially change your life. I know a number of people, including myself, but other friends who've said, that it's another world, it's another way of viewing the world. There are news podcasts out there, both very mainstream, like the BBC Global News podcast, which I use for work, for listening exercises for my students, etc. But there's lots of independent radio out there, and some of it's left-wing, liberal, conservative, right-wing. Other people are just looking dispassionately at the news, and leaving aside the fact that we probably all have our own, we definitely have our own prejudices. If you can just sit there listening with an open mind and try and forget everything you've been told before, you really can make a big breakthrough in your life. And I would urge people to do that, because we need people to be properly questioning things that they've read, not questioning it within a sort of limited narrative. You need to really question things and not believe anything you read, not believe anything you're told. Check it out for yourself and try and find, your own truth, or what you believe is the truth. The truth is an incredibly elusive thing. Anyone will tell you. So, I'm going to have a look now at the John Lennon song, Gimme Some Truth, that this podcast is named after. So I'll go through the lyrics. I mean, a lot of it is fairly self-explanatory. I think if you look at the lyrics as a whole, it was released in 71, but Beatles were jamming it in 69. So it's obviously the height of Vietnam. So the meaning of it is very clear. It's not particularly cryptic. But I'm just going to go through a few things. So obviously the chorus is, all I want is the truth, just give me some truth. And it's very much a rock vocal. He really spits out the lyrics. It's not a punk song by any means, but his delivery is quite punk. So anyway, the first couple of verses. So I'm sick and tired of hearing things from uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocritics. That's hypocritics. I've had enough of reading things by neurotic, psychotic, pig-headed politicians. Now, of course, the way that should be delivered, rather than in my rather calm voice, is something like this.
I'm sick and tired of hearing things from uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocritics. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth. I've had enough of reading things by neurotic, psychotic, pig-headed politicians. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth.
Brilliant adjectives being used in these. And he's not pulling his punches, is he? So uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded. Really, I think he's having a go more at conservatives than anybody else. And of course, there's small c conservative, politically conservative, but uptight, short-sighted. Now, of course, short-sighted could mean physically, myopic. But short-sighted also means someone who doesn't have a vision for the future. And this is interesting because whether he meant it or not, this is quite an interesting sort of reference to the short cycle of politics. We have these systems in, I know the systems in Britain and America fairly well. The Spanish system and the Italian system went kind of over my head a little bit, but I've had a passing interest in those. But, politicians in this sort of 4 or 5 year cycle, in a way, have to be short-sighted because they don't know whether they're still going to be there in a few years. And since being a politician is now a career, and it's a well-paid career, then that's what you're going to get. You're not going to get visionaries. So I think John Lennon, in other interviews that I've heard, he was quite sort of progressive in the sense of hating the system, and he felt that it wasn't really worth hating individuals. Nixon, for example. Nixon was carrying out the system, let's say. Watergate aside. There are certain things that are just going to happen, whoever is in there. And Obama was a perfect example. Does everyone remember Hope and Truth? There you go, Freudian slip there. Hope and Change. Obviously, truth is attached to that as well, even though that's not what he actually said. But, what happened there? Obama walked into a system, met the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was, I'm sure, being told what the war agenda was going to be for X amount of time.
I have this feeling who's ever elected president, no matter what your promises you promise on the campaign trail, blah, 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 when you win, you go into this smoky room with the 12 industrialists, capitalist scumfucks who got you in there, and you're in this smoky room, and this little screen comes down, and a big guy in a cigar, roll the film. And it's a shot of a Kennedy assassination from an angle you've never seen before. It looks suspiciously off the grassy knoll. And then the screen goes up and the lights come up and they go to the new president. Any questions?
Anyway, I've had enough of reading things, neurotic, psychotic, pig-headed politicians. Now, another famous John Lennon interview clip was the one you heard at the beginning of this podcast. which was from 1968, where he's basically talking about the leaders as insane and saying, you know, do they really know what they're doing? Does anyone know what they're doing? So yeah, very interesting. I mean, he's talking about the leaders as actual, you know, as maniacs and as insane, you know, neurotic, psychotic. And that's become a very sort of popular idea again, is that, you know, maybe this system is a little bit psychotic, and that, or at least neurotic at the very least, and that certain people, sociopaths, maybe psychopaths, tend to rise to the top of this system because it suits them and they're very good. Someone like Tony Blair, for example, I don't know. I'm sure he'll never be diagnosed, but I'd put him in that category. So, you know, he's having a go at politicians in general, but John Lennon knew as well as anyone else that they were part of a system. And in fact, you know, he never really said much about bankers, but I'm sure if he was alive now, he would have cottoned on to that, of how absurd the banking system and what a complete rip-off a lot of it is before the financial crash. And then he gets to the famous sort of bridge, if you want to call it that. No short-haired, yellow-bellied son of Tricky Dicky is going to Mother Hubbard soft-soap me with just a pocket full of hope. Money for dope, money for rope. Again, sounds a little bit better when delivered like this.
No short-haired, yellow-bellied son of Tricky Dicky's gonna Mother Hubbard soft soap me for just a pocket full of hope. Money for dope, money for rope. Woo-hoo.
So we take that through. So the short-haired, again, uptight, short-haired, short-sighted, wearing a suit. He's having a go at one particular sort of archetype, if you like. Although, ironically, by the late 60s, of course, as John Lennon again said in his interview with David Wigg, I think the original tape was called the Beatles tapes. Good interviews, individually with all four Beatles. He actually says that by the late 60s, most businessmen have got something akin to a mop-top haircut. Not exactly, but you get the picture. Long hair had become accepted by the late 60s. And then this very interesting line is going to Mother Hubbard, soft soap me. Now, of course, Mother Hubbard is a nursery rhyme, Old Mother Hubbard. It's all about an old lady and her dog. And I did actually look on Wikipedia, and they said that apparently it was supposed to be some sort of political commentary, but I couldn't quite get that myself. But anyway, soft soap is, of course, to do with flattery, to do with getting someone to do something by flattering them. So again, John Lennon as a big pop star, as a Beatles, you know, at the level of Beatles fame, would have known all about people soft-soaping him. Interesting with Mother Hubbard, there is, I think any good self-respecting Beatles fan is aware of the Ruttles, this brilliant creation, which is, I think, conceived by Eric Idle, who was obviously part of Monty Python. But Neil Innes did all the songs. Fantastic. I mean, they're Beatle-esque songs with jokes galore in them. And one of the kind of jokes, the recurring theme, is using sort of old English expressions. Like, obviously, the song Help, that was featured in the Ruttles, but it was called Ouch. Just to give you a little bit. So obviously Help, the verse is when I was younger, so much younger than today. I never needed anybody's help in any way. And in Ouch is, I must admit I fell for you right from the start. Now when we meet, all kinds of things, it seems upset the apple cart. So to upset the apple cart, is not only was it referenced by George Harrison in the song Not Guilty, but I think Neil Innes there was kind of showing that the Beatles were very English and they would put these expressions in there. And John Lennon, you know, as well as being the rocker, you know, if you sort of think of music hall, you'd always think of Paul McCartney and, you know, Honey Pie and those kind of songs. Of course, a good example of John Lennon referencing a music hall act was at the end of Free as a Bird. Free as a Bird, of course, was originally a John Lennon demo from 78. And at the end of it, there was this incredible accident where they actually played the end of it backwards, and it came out as something sounding like Made by John Lennon. I'm not going to put the clip here because I don't want this podcast to be struck down or struck off immediately. The Beatles organisation is a bit notorious for that. I'm going to hopefully get away with the other clips I've put here. Anyway, so what I was going to say was that when that was turned the right way round, the comment was "turned out nice again," which was a George Formby catchphrase. George Formby was one of the most classic examples of that sort of music hall, pre-rock and roll era. Most famous song, of course, was played on the ukulele, When I'm Cleaning Windows. But amazing to think that John Lennon's sitting there in a huge apartment in New York, and a George Formby quote comes into his head. Very interesting. I think John Lennon had people like him have a very expansive lot of references that they can draw on when they're, either composing music or just talking in interviews or writing or whatever it is. They have this sort of all round, these kind of references. So it's quite funny to see Mother Hubbard in there in this sort of angry song. To soft soap me with a pocket full of hope. Again, Obama, hope and change. There you go. What a visionary John Lennon was. But, politicians are always selling hope, and they're selling, I'm going to be the one that stops the rot and stops the trend. And politicians are, they're well aware of the system as well. And that's why they try and always present themselves as against it, even up to Trump, I'm not one of those elites, I'm one of you. That's always the mantra, isn't it? Money for dope, very interesting that a number of CIA agents have come out and said, imagine they're all retired CIA agents, have come out and said, about the CIA dealing in cocaine. Gary Webb, Dark Alliance, was a good book. He died mysteriously. Mike Rupert was another one who came out as a famous clip of him confronting, I think it's the director of the CIA. It's a long time since I've seen that clip. Just popped into my head about the CIA dealing drugs, and of course we know they never say this when they're talking about Vietnam War, but there was the opium trade going on there in Laos, and there's a whole sort of undercurrent of drugs to the Vietnam War, for example. And then money for rope is, again, there's an expression, money for old rope, which is money that's very easy to earn. So I guess they're talking about the government's earning money on the side, perhaps, that we don't know about. And then the remainder of the verses, it's actually it's a fairly short song. I'm sick to death of seeing things from tight-lipped, condescending mama's little chauvinists. So keeping tight-lipped is obviously to do with secrets. And I talked earlier about sin by omission in the media. Condescending, a lot of people say that David Icke used to say this, that a lot of people who just believe what they read unquestioningly, they're basically looking for, mummy, daddy, government. So parents could be accused of condescending to their children. If you take that literally, they're talking down to them because they're modifying their language to talk to an undeveloped child. So politicians, can be condescending for sure. But maybe some people want that from them. They want this voice of authority to talk down to you and tell you what's what. And then mama's little chauvinists, I don't know whether he's making a reference to powerful people being a bit like children. Obviously, Trump has his incredible childlike qualities. Just the image of him sort of under the covers, tweeting to North Korea or tweeting to the world at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's absolutely absurd, I know. And then I've had enough of watching scenes of schizophrenic, egocentric, paranoid prima donnas. That pretty much speaks for itself. So he's going through the whole gamut of damning adjectives, basically, of, mental illness and psychosis. That's pretty powerful stuff, and as you've just heard before, he really spits the lyrics out. And of course, famously, when John Lennon was recording Imagine, he gave all the musicians who worked on it, or certainly the main musicians, a copy of the lyrics, and he said, I want you to read this, because this is what I'm saying to the world, what I'm going to say to the world. And I think one version of the story is actually that, read this and make sure that you want to be involved in this, because I'm going out on the line here. And if you want to be involved in this, then you've got to go for it full-bloodedly. That was the gist of it. So there was also a documentary called Gimme Some Truth, which was the making of Imagine, which I first saw around 2000, I think, or something like that. It was released. And it's very interesting. It's definitely worth watching. John Lennon, who's in that documentary, comes across to me as a kind of nervy, edgy person. He's also very charismatic. He's also very confident. Well, in certain situations, I would say, when he's around people, Yoko, George Harrison's obviously there for a while, Phil Spector's there. But I don't know what John was using at that time, but I would be amazed if he'd actually given up hard drugs by the early 70s, as some commentators and biographers have said. And in Fred Seaman's book, Living on Borrowed Time, which is a book I'd recommend, he was John Lennon's personal assistant for the last year or two of his life. Fred Seaman said there was always this air of tension, and John Lennon in this book actually says to Fred Seaman, I'm on the edge already, don't make it any worse for me by, giving me bad news or whatever. But that's what comes across, and then John Lennon has a legendary few sort of temper tantrums, if you like, famously during the recording of Oh Yoko. There's also an amazing moment when they're recording Oh My Love, this sort of a lovely, delicate song. Oh my love. And then someone makes a noise. He's going, don't change the fucking reel, or something like that. And then goes back to singing this lovely, sweet song. But, you know, as I said to Dave Thurmeyer, the contradictions is what makes this guy so compelling. So definitely recommend Gimme Some Truth documentary. And then, of course, there's another one that's recently come out. I think it's had a theatrical release called John and Yoko Above Us, Only Sky, which I think tied in with the big reissue of the album and the outtakes last year. Definitely worth watching, and there was quite a lot of stuff that I hadn't seen, and I pride myself on being a John Lennon / Beatles snob who's seen and heard everything. I'm very happy when I see or hear or read something that I haven't before, as happened with the White Album last year. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed me indulging myself by riffing on the subject of truth. I hope I've given you a few things to think about. There's going to be a lot of links, I can tell that already, for things I've mentioned that I'm going to put in the description of the podcast, as it is at the moment on SoundCloud. Again, I'm working on haven't had time to work on the website, but at some point I'll sort that out, maybe in the Easter holidays. Got some more interviews lined up. As I've said before, this podcast will be a mixture of solo stuff, but also discussions with various people. So lots of good stuff in the pipeline. I'm likely to stick with fortnightly for now, and I'll definitely try and stick to that for the time being. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you in 2 weeks from now. All the best. Goodbye.
Nice again.